Hello, weary traveller. Come, sit by my fire. The night is long, and the stars above hold many secrets. I am the lonely knight, and tonight I shall share with you an account about how the collapse of Rome scattered the wisdom of healing, and how the long centuries that followed saw medicine stumble into shadows, where superstition reigned more than knowledge. Close your eyes, if you will, and drift back with me to a time of honor, peril, and the song of steel at dawn. Tell me, wanderer, where do you listen from, and what hour finds you now? If my tale stirs something in you, then leave a like, and subscribe only if your heart says these stories are worth returning to. I still recall the whispers of old men who had seen the empire fall, when Rome's proud roads led not to triumph, but to silence. The Western world lost more than armies. It lost its memory of healing. Libraries that once preserved Galen's careful dissections and Hippocrates' measured wisdom crumbled with the stones of great cities. Scrolls were left to rot in monasteries or burned in the chaos of invasion. With them vanished the fragile bridge between knowledge and survival, leaving only fragments for those who came after. In the days when Rome's eagle still flew, physicians studied the body with precision unknown to later centuries. They spoke of pulse, of prognosis, of balance between life's inner workings. But as legions dissolved and cities emptied, such language grew faint, like a candle in a storm. In its place came charms, whispered prayers, and remedies drawn more from fear than from understanding. I saw how easily truth was buried beneath the rubble of collapsing walls. The Germanic tribes who settled in former Roman lands cared more for warcraft than scholarship. Their strength lay in iron and law, not in parchment or medicine. Without schools to nurture inquiry, the healer became little more than a village wise woman or a wandering bone setter. Their skill rested on herbs and instinct, often useful, but lacking the discipline of science. Illness became less a matter of study and more a visitation from unseen forces. I have walked through ruins where marble colonnades once stood, now tangled with weeds. In those empty forums, I imagined the physicians who once lectured to eager students, their words echoing under vaulted ceilings. All of it gone, swept away by hunger, fire, and conquest. Knowledge is fragile when not guarded. Wisdom fades quickly when parchment gives way to ash. And so a continent drifted into a long night of forgetting. Superstition grew in the cracks left by silence. People believed disease came from angry spirits, or the weight of sin pressing upon the flesh. Amulets of bone, charms sewn into clothing, and muttered invocations stood where once careful diagnosis had ruled. A fever was no longer a sign of imbalance, but of divine displeasure. The body, stripped of inquiry, became a vessel for fear. I remember the faces of mothers who prayed harder than they dared hope, for they had little else to cling to. The East, under Byzantium's careful hand, still preserved much of the ancient teaching. In Constantinople, the writings of Galen were copied and debated, while in the West they lay silent under dust. Those of us who travelled between lands carried fragments back, yet fragments could not restore the whole. Europe's healers were like men with broken swords, still dangerous, still useful, but never as they were forged to be. I came upon monks in Ireland who laboured by candlelight, preserving a page here, a verse there. Their work was pious, yet uneven, for they copied words without always grasping their meaning. Still, I bowed my head in gratitude, for even a half-remembered truth was better than none at all. Those fragile manuscripts were seeds, waiting for centuries before they would sprout again in fuller light. Looking back, I know that the fall of Rome did not only topple empires, but unmoored the body itself from reason. The sick were left to prayers, potions, and blind hope, for the art of healing had wandered into shadow. It would take centuries and much suffering before those ancient voices were heard again in the halls of Europe. Until then, medicine often harmed more than it healed, and lives flickered out as swiftly as the sparks of my fire tonight. In the early centuries of faith, I watched the cross rise above broken temples, reshaping not only prayer, but the way men and women understood their own suffering. Illness was no longer seen as a mystery of the body alone, but as a message from heaven. A cough, a fever, or a swelling could be interpreted as a chastisement for sin, or as a test of endurance granted by God. To heal was not always to cure. Often it was to reconcile the soul to its maker. The Holy Scriptures were read as guides to the meaning of pain. Job's torment became a mirror for the sick, and Paul's words about the weakness of the flesh gave comfort to those wasting away. I saw priests place their hands upon trembling shoulders, whispering absolution more readily than offering remedy. Faith became medicine in itself, yet for many, it brought resignation rather than relief. Disease lingered, but men consoled themselves that heaven's gates might open through suffering. Pilgrimages grew from this belief, and I met countless travelers walking barefoot across Europe in search of miracles. They carried their sores and fevers to the shrines of saints, believing a touch of a relic or a drink from a holy spring might restore them. At Canterbury, Compostela, or Rome, I saw their faces alight with hope, though many returned no healthier than when they began. Still, the journey itself gave meaning, and in their hearts, faith was as vital as bread. The Church also warned that disease could come as punishment for wickedness. Whole communities trembled at leprosy, seeing it not only as contagion, but as the visible mark of God's judgment. Lepers were driven to the edges of villages, forced to wear bells and live apart. Few cared to question whether such cruelty was just. It was easier to believe separation preserved both body and soul. I confess, I too once shrank away when I heard that mournful chime. Monks and nuns became guardians of the sick, their care infused with prayer. Within cloisters, I watched them chant psalms over the afflicted, anoint them with oil, and place reliquaries at their bedside. Some believed the breath of saints lingered in those relics, capable of healing wounds and banishing fevers. Yet the body often worsened, and the faithful died clinging to a crucifix. The soul was prepared for eternity, even if the flesh was abandoned to decay. This devotion to the divine made men slow to trust natural explanations. To suggest that illness might come from spoiled food, foul water, or unseen contagion was to risk charges of impiety. Better to say it was God's will than to seek causes in the earth. I recall physicians who dared whisper of humours or air, only to be silenced by suspicion. Inquiry could not easily breathe in a world where heaven spoke louder than reason. And yet, amid the shadows, compassion bloomed. Christianity taught mercy to the suffering, urging care for the weak and alms for the dying. Hospitals, though meagre, arose beside monasteries, offering beds to the poor who would otherwise perish in the streets. Their purpose was not cure, but comfort, to remind the forgotten that God had not turned away. I remember kneeling beside straw pallets, hearing prayers rise like smoke above the stench of infection. The Church gave meaning where knowledge faltered. Men endured agony, believing it brought them closer to Christ. Women bore children with faith that Mary herself watched over them, and the dying clutched relics as if eternity could be held in their hands. Medicine was chained to heaven's judgment, and the body often paid the price. Such was the inheritance of a world that trusted salvation more than science, leaving countless souls to fade beneath the weight of faith. When the turmoil of the outside world grew too fierce, it was within stone walls and cloistered gardens that knowledge clung to life. Monasteries became quiet havens where quills scraped across parchment, copying fragments of Galen and Hippocrates. I often passed through such places, weary from travel, and found monks who knew more of herbs than of swords. They saw illness through the lens of prayer, yet they preserved pieces of wisdom that would otherwise have vanished into dust. The monastic infirmary was simple, its beds narrow and its air heavy with the scent of dried plants hanging from rafters. Patients were offered remedies brewed from sage, fennel, and horehound, their bitterness softened with honey. But the greater part of healing came through psalms sung in echoing chapels and the laying on of hands in silent devotion. The body was treated, but it was the soul that received the deeper attention. Herbal gardens flourished behind high walls, carefully tended by brothers who believed each plant bore the imprint of divine intention. They cultivated rue for fevers, comfrey for wounds, and valerian to calm restless minds. I walked those paths, marveling at the order and patience with which the monks worked. Still, their remedies were often uncertain, drawn from trial, scripture, and the doctrine of signatures, which claimed the shape of a plant revealed its purpose. Copying ancient texts was as sacred as prayer. Yet many monks could not fully understand what they preserved, transcribing Greek and Latin words whose meaning lay hidden to them. Thus, knowledge endured more as echo than as voice. A remedy, noted by Galen, might survive on parchment, but its application was bent by superstition or misreading. In this way, truth was kept alive, though faint and distorted, like light seen through stained glass. Despite their devotion, the monks relied heavily on rituals that placed spiritual health above the body's needs. Confession, penance, and blessings were as common as salves and decoctions. A man with fever might be bled until weak, then prayed over as if illness were a demon to be banished. The sick sometimes left with lighter hearts but frailer limbs, for faith was often their only medicine. I saw many who lingered in hope, yet slipped quietly into death. Still, monasteries gave shelter in an age when the sick were often abandoned. Pilgrims and peasants found in those walls a measure of care and dignity, however imperfect. The monks believed that tending to the suffering mirrored Christ's command to show mercy. Though cures were rare, compassion was plentiful, and even a bowl of broth or a clean bed was a balm in times of despair. It was mercy, not science, that marked their legacy. In these cloisters, one could also witness the tension between learning and obedience. Some monks longed to study the natural causes of illness, but the Church's authority demanded that they frame their findings within the will of God. To question too deeply risked heresy. And so, even as seeds of reason were sown, they were carefully hidden beneath layers of prayer. I often wondered how much wisdom lay buried in silence, waiting for bolder ages to speak it aloud. As I reflect, I cannot scorn these men. Though their remedies often failed, they preserved fragments of a broken past and offered solace when little else remained. Theirs was a medicine of mercy, fragile and incomplete. Yet without it, the darkness would have been deeper still. I remember the toll of bells at dusk, echoing through gardens of lavender and thyme, calling both monk and patient to prayer. In that harmony of voices, hope flickered, even as the body waned. Long before my time, Greek physicians spoke of 4 fluids flowing within the body, and their words echoed through the centuries into the halls of medieval Europe. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile were said to govern health, temperament, and even destiny. A man's cheerfulness, melancholy, anger, or calm were traced not to his heart or mind, but to the measure of these hidden streams. I remember physicians who could not meet an ill gaze without first naming which humour had gone astray. Every ailment was seen as imbalance. A fever meant an excess of yellow bile, while sadness pointed to too much black bile pooling within. Even the seasons and stars were believed to tilt these inner scales. Winter thickened phlegm, summer ignited blood. To be healed was not merely to mend the body, but to restore harmony between the elements that ruled flesh and spirit alike. Yet in practice, the cure often became as dangerous as the sickness. Bleeding was the most common answer, and I saw it performed countless times. A cut of the vein or the placing of leeches was thought to draw away the excess. Patients grew pale and weak, yet the physician declared them balanced. Some lived, many did not. I can still recall the trembling hands of peasants as they offered their veins, believing the knife might restore what only nature could mend. Purging was another weapon in this arsenal, forcing the body to expel what was thought corrupt. Strong herbs, sometimes poisonous, were given to induce vomiting or diarrhea. I watched men clutch their bellies in agony, emptied of strength as well as sickness. What they lost was often more than what harmed them, but so powerful was belief in the humours that suffering itself was praised as proof of healing begun. Even personality was chained to this system. Those prone to laughter were called sanguine, the calm labelled phlegmatic, the angry choleric, the mournful melancholic. It shaped not only medicine, but the very way people judged one another. A lord might be excused for cruelty as a matter of excess bile, while a nun's quietness could be explained by cold phlegm. Thus, the soul itself was bound by theories of fluids unseen. Universities enshrined these teachings, lecturing from Galen's texts with near religious devotion. Students learned more of diagrams than of bodies, for dissection was rare and frowned upon. To contradict Galen was to invite suspicion, even if experience whispered otherwise. I saw young healers repeat the words of ancients as if they were scripture, never daring to let doubt pierce the veil of tradition. The chain of error lengthened, passed from master to pupil. Yet not all was folly. Some remedies, born of humoral thought, did give relief. Cooling herbs eased fevers, warming broths revived the weak. But these successes were few, and they owed more to chance than to theory. For every patient helped, another was drained of life through needless bleeding or harsh purges. The balance sought was too often paid with the coin of human frailty. Looking back, I see the four humours as both a guide and a prison. They preserved fragments of ancient thought but blinded generations to deeper truths. The body was reduced to streams of imagined fluids, while the true workings of flesh and disease lay hidden. I walked among the sick who trusted in this order, and I mourned how often their faith was betrayed by the very hands sworn to heal them. There were healers who would not so much as touch a patient before first lifting their eyes to the night sky. I remember lying beneath the same heavens, watching them trace patterns with trembling fingers, declaring that Saturn's gaze or Mars' fire ruled the fate of the sick. A man's body was mapped to the zodiac, each sign claiming dominion over flesh and bone. To these physicians, no vein could be opened unless the stars consented. Charts filled their chambers, painted with constellations and the cycles of the moon. The position of the planets was thought to dictate when to bleed, when to administer herbs, or when to refrain entirely. I saw a farmer denied treatment because Venus had not yet shifted from her place in the heavens. He lay sweating with fever, his hope bound not to skill, but to a distant star. It was believed Aries governed the head, Taurus the throat, and so forth through the body. To cut the wrong part at the wrong time was feared to invite death itself. And so, sick men were left waiting for the heavens to align, even as their bodies withered. The stars became gatekeepers, and delay became a cruel partner to disease. This union of medicine and astrology gave physicians an air of mystery. Villagers trusted their charts as much as their remedies, believing the wisdom of the cosmos far greater than the frailty of man. Yet behind the parchment and ink, illness did not wait. I recall children whose breath grew shallow while healers debated the phases of the moon. Time slipped away, more deadly than the fever itself. Still, it must be said that the sky gave rhythm to life in those centuries. Crops were sown and harvested by its patterns, journeys undertaken by its guidance. It was natural then that the body too should be thought a reflection of the firmament. To question this was rare, for to doubt the stars was to doubt the order of creation itself. Faith in heaven's influence was stitched into every layer of belief. Some physicians attempted to weave astrology with humoral theory, claiming that planets stirred the fluids within us. The moon was said to swell phlegm, Mars to ignite bile. These intricate blends of thought gave an appearance of knowledge, but in truth they drew men further from the reality of illness. Patients bore the weight of these errors, paying with their bodies for the marriage of earth and sky. And yet, not all was superstition without merit. The careful observation of seasons and cycles sometimes revealed patterns of sickness. Malaria returned with the marsh's mists, and winter brought coughs that spared no hearth. Such insights might have grown into true understanding, but they were smothered beneath the veil of astrology. What truth the stars hinted at was hidden beneath layers of false certainty. I cannot forget the solemn faces of those who gazed skyward for answers, while suffering lay before them on the ground. The heavens may inspire awe, but the body requires more than constellations to mend. The sick learned too late that stars gave little comfort in the shadow of death, and the healer's reliance on their guidance left many graves where cures might have been found. Everywhere I travelled, from the poorest villages to the halls of lords, I saw the same ritual repeated, the opening of veins. Bloodletting was believed to be the answer to nearly every ailment, whether fever, melancholy, or a pain in the chest. Physicians carried ornate lancets, while barbers used rough blades, both claiming the same authority. Patients placed their trust in the flowing crimson, persuaded that weakness was a step toward health. The procedure could be as simple as a shallow cut to the arm, or as elaborate as leeches fastened to the skin. I remember the quiet drip into bowls, the pale faces of those who endured, and the prayers whispered that this sacrifice would restore balance. Some left lighter only in spirit, others never rose again from the bed, yet the practice endured, bound more to tradition than to outcome. Leeches were treasured, collected from marshes, and kept in jars like sacred tools. To watch them swell upon the body was to see hope made flesh for those desperate to be cured. The healers said these creatures drew only the corrupt blood, sparing the pure. But I saw strong men collapse after such treatments, their strength drained beyond repair. The leech, though harmless in itself, became a partner in folly. It was not only illness that summoned the knife, prevention too was preached. Healthy men submitted to seasonal bleedings, believing it would preserve vigor and ward off disease. I saw farmers, hale and sturdy, weakened before the harvest because custom demanded they be cut. The irony was bitter. In seeking health, many lost the very strength needed to toil and survive. Records were sometimes kept, marking the volume of blood taken as if it were a measure of precision. Physicians spoke of ounces and balance, yet their science was guesswork, a ritual of numbers rather than knowledge. Too much, and death followed swiftly. Too little, and the cure was declared incomplete. I walked away from many a house where mourning hung heavy, the family convinced their loved one had simply been beyond saving. Even kings and nobles endured the same fate, for no rank was beyond the reach of this practice. I recall stories of rulers who grew weaker under the care of their physicians, their courts blind to the truth that the cure had hastened their end. Power could not protect against the authority of custom, and so even the mighty bled in vain. Critics were rare, though a few voices whispered doubt. They saw that those who survived often did so despite the knife, not because of it. But to speak against such a widespread belief was to risk ridicule, or worse. It was easier to join in the ritual than to stand against centuries of tradition. And so the silence of doubt became as deadly as the act itself. The memory that lingers with me most is not of physicians, but of the patients themselves. Their trust was absolute, their willingness to endure unquestioned. They sought life and found weakness. They reached for cure and grasped at shadows. Bloodletting, more than any other practice, revealed the tragedy of medieval medicine. The body betrayed not by fate alone, but by the very hands sworn to preserve it. When wounds festered and no herb or prayer brought relief, the last refuge was fire. I have seen men pinned down while red-hot irons pressed against their flesh, the smell of burning skin rising like incense of despair. Physicians swore it sealed bleeding and drove away corruption, yet it left scars deeper than the cut itself. The cries of the suffering echoed long after the flames cooled, reminding all who listened that medicine could be more dreadful than war. Sometimes boiling oil was poured into open injuries, thought to cleanse by heat and purify by pain. The soldiers who endured such treatment often wished the sword had finished them in battle. Infection was common, fever inevitable, yet this method persisted. In truth, the heat sometimes stanched bleeding, but more often it invited death. I can still see the eyes of those who looked upon the pot of oil and knew their agony was yet to come. Surgery itself was a rarity, attempted only when no other path remained. Without anesthesia, every cut was a torment endured while fully awake. Men bit down on leather straps, women clutched rosaries, and children screamed until their voices broke. Even the surgeons trembled, for they knew their skill was crude and their tools unsuited to the task. Still, the knife was wielded, for hope clings stubbornly even to the edge of steel. In the absence of refined instruments, the same blades used for hunting or craft were brought to the operating bench. I saw saws meant for wood and shears meant for cloth pressed into service on human flesh. Rust and dirt clung to them, carrying unseen enemies into already broken bodies. The surgeon's hand might be steady, but the tools themselves betrayed the patient. Thus, the wound was doubled. One from the knife, the other from the filth it carried. Blood loss was a peril greater than the wound itself. Many did not survive the cutting, their strength pouring out faster than any remedy could replace it. Surgeons moved quickly, binding with cloth or pressing with cautery to staunch the flow. Yet haste often meant imprecision, and lives slipped away in the balance. The battlefield was strewn not only with the dead from combat, but with those who perished under the knife meant to save them. There were moments, rare as spring rain, when these brutal methods succeeded. An arrow extracted, a bleeding vein sealed, a limb saved from ruin. In those instances, gratitude shone through the suffering, and the healer was praised as chosen by God. But such victories were few, and the cost in agony immense. For every life spared, many others were lost in the attempt. The faith in cauterization was born of necessity, not of wisdom. With no knowledge of invisible contagions, no potions to kill the unseen, heat seemed a force strong enough to conquer corruption. It was a war waged blindly, with fire as the only weapon. And though the weapon often turned against those it sought to save, men clung to it for lack of alternatives. As I reflect, the memory of those searing treatments humbles me. It is a reminder that courage is not only found in the knight who rides into battle, but also in the patient who lies still beneath the iron. Their strength was silent, their suffering immense, and their fate uncertain. In those flames, I saw the cruelty of ignorance, yet also the endurance of the human spirit, burning as fiercely as the iron itself. Along the narrow streets of towns, the scent of herbs often drifted from small shops where apothecaries plied their trade. Their shelves were crowded with jars of dried leaves, roots, and powders, each labeled in careful script or simple symbols for those who could not read. I recall standing in such a place, surrounded by the earthy smell of chamomile, mint, and rosemary, mingled with stranger aromas that hinted at danger as much as cure. Hope was measured in spoonfuls, sold to the weary and desperate. The knowledge of these men and women came from many streams, Roman tradition, Celtic practice, and even Arabic texts brought by travelers. Willow bark, long used to ease fevers, offered real relief, though few understood why. Garlic was praised for cleansing wounds, and thyme for easing the chest. Yet alongside such gifts of nature were concoctions of deadly nightshade, mercury, or arsenic, poisons that turned remedies into killers. The line between medicine and harm was thin indeed. Each apothecary guarded their recipes like secrets of alchemy. Remedies were prepared in pestles and mortars, ground until fragrant or foul, then mixed with wine, honey, or vinegar. Some brews comforted the body, others only worsened its decline. I once saw a man given a potion for pain, only to slip into a sleep from which he never woke. Still, the trust of the people endured, for to have something was better than nothing. In villages where physicians were rare, the apothecary's voice carried great weight. Peasants came with toothaches, fevers, or festering wounds, and left with packets of powder or bundles of herbs. These remedies, though uneven, gave them a sense of control over what they could not otherwise face. It was a small light in the darkness of ignorance, and many clung to it as one clings to prayer. Prices varied, and not all could afford the mixtures behind the counter. Some traded eggs, wool, or bread for what they needed, while the wealthier purchased exotic imports like cinnamon, nutmeg, or saffron. These spices, thought to carry healing powers, also marked status, a sign that one could reach beyond the village for the wonders of distant lands. Yet whether humble or rare, all remedies shared the same uncertain promise. Books known as herbals circulated slowly, illustrated with drawings of plants and notes on their virtues. I once leafed through a manuscript where a root shaped like a man was said to cure melancholy, while leaves in the shape of lungs promised relief for coughs. Such ideas followed the doctrine of signatures, which claimed God had marked plants with their purpose. Though flawed, these books preserved lore that otherwise would have vanished entirely. Some apothecaries worked alongside physicians, while others stood in rivalry with them. The physician diagnosed, the apothecary prepared, yet disputes often arose over profit and pride. In truth, both leaned heavily on tradition, and the patient bore the outcome of their quarrels. At times their combined efforts eased suffering, at others they hastened decline. The boundary between healer and merchant blurred within those walls of herbs and jars. What lingers in my memory is the mixture of faith and fear that coloured every visit to such places. One could leave with a draught that soothed, or with a poison masked in sweetness. The apothecary's trade was born of both knowledge and guesswork, and its legacy is written in the countless graves as much as in the few recoveries. In those dimly lit shops, humanity searched desperately for healing, often finding both remedy and ruin in the same vial. In the bustling heart of towns, one could often find the striped pole turning slowly in the wind, a sign that both grooming and healing awaited inside. The barber's chair was not only for trimming beards, but also for pulling teeth, lancing boils, and opening veins. I have seen men enter laughing for a shave and leave pale from bloodletting or extraction, their mouths stuffed with rags to staunch the bleeding. The smell of soap mingled strangely with the metallic tang of iron tools. These barbers were craftsmen, not scholars, yet they filled a void where trained physicians were scarce or too costly. Their skill came from practice rather than from parchment, and their instruments hung plainly on the walls, razors, knives, and saws gleaming in the candlelight. What they lacked in learning they made up in boldness, for hesitation was fatal when the knife touched flesh. Still, I watched more than one patient fall victim to their rough hands. Amputation was among their most dreaded tasks, performed with speed and little regard for the agony endured. A limb could be severed in minutes, but infection often claimed what the saw did not. Boiling oil or hot irons followed to seal the stump, and many never survived the days after. Yet when battlefields filled with broken bodies, it was often the barber surgeons who saved what little they could. Toothache drove many to their doors, for decay was common and unbearable. Without knowledge of dentistry, the only answer was extraction. I remember the groans of men gripping the chair, eyes wide with terror, as teeth were wrenched free by force. Sometimes more than the tooth was lost, as jaws cracked or gums tore, leaving wounds that festered. Still, people returned, for the relief of ending pain outweighed the fear of the chair. The barber's pole itself tells the story. Red for blood, white for bandages, and the spiral marking the flow of veins. Few who passed it doubted what awaited inside. It was a symbol both of grooming and of crude surgery, where the line between beauty and survival blurred. To this day, whenever I see its colors, I remember the mingling of vanity and desperation in those chambers. Some barbers rose in status, forming guilds and gaining recognition as surgeons' apprentices. Others remained simple tradesmen, mocked by physicians yet indispensable to the common folk. The universities might scorn them, but in alleys and villages, it was the barber's blade that stood between a man and lingering death. Knowledge was uneven, but courage was plentiful. That courage was often the only currency they could offer. Not all were careless. I met barbers who washed their tools, sharpened them with care, and sought remedies from apothecaries to ease their patients' suffering. Their work was a blend of craft, necessity, and the hope that skill might triumph over ignorance. They did what they could with what they had, though the results were uncertain. I cannot scorn their efforts, for without them, countless wounds would have gone untended. When I think back on these men, I see them as both saviors and butchers, bound by circumstance rather than choice. They stood at the crossroads of vanity and survival, wielding blades that could shape a beard or sever a limb. Their legacy is written in scars, in mouths left toothless, in lives both saved and lost. In their chairs, men surrendered not only to the barber's hands, but to the thin hope that skill might prevail against the tide of suffering. 10. Hospitals as places of death. When weary travelers sought refuge for their sickness, they often found their way to hospitals run by monks or nuns. These were not houses of healing as one might imagine today, but places where the poor and dying were gathered beneath one roof. I recall entering such halls, the air thick with incense meant to mask the stench of infection. Straw pallets stretched from wall to wall, each bearing a soul waiting for release more than for recovery. The intention was mercy, to offer shelter where none existed. Food was given, prayers recited, and confessions heard. Yet the crowding of the sick in such confined spaces bred pestilence. I remember coughing echoing through the night, spreading from bed to bed as if death itself walked among them. What began as a refuge often became a trap, where the living lay alongside the dying, their fates entwined. Cleanliness was rarely understood, and water was precious. Washing of hands or tools was neglected, not from cruelty, but from ignorance. Bedclothes were seldom changed, and vermin made their homes in the straw. I once saw a nurse brush away fleas from a patient's blanket with her bare hand, only to carry them to the next bed. The will to serve was strong, but the knowledge of contagion was absent. The role of these institutions was less to heal the body than to prepare the soul. Priests moved among the beds with crucifixes, whispering absolution to the weak. The focus was eternity, not survival, and many who entered expected never to leave. The chants of prayer filled the air more than the sounds of remedies being prepared. It was a place where heaven was closer than health. There were exceptions, of course. Some hospitals included herbal gardens and apothecaries who sought to relieve pain with salves and teas. Yet even these efforts were meagre against the tide of illness. A wound that might have healed in solitude often worsened in the company of many others. The gathering of sufferers became its own curse, a breeding ground for affliction rather than its cure. Those of higher rank rarely set foot in such places, preferring to be treated in private chambers. Hospitals were left for the poor, the abandoned, and the traveller without coin. They became symbols of charity, yes, but also of resignation. To be admitted was almost an acknowledgement that one's days were numbered. I saw families weep at the threshold, knowing the door closed more often on the living than the dead. The devotion of those who tended these wards cannot be dismissed. Many nuns and brothers worked themselves into illness, breathing the same foul air, sharing the same risks. They gave what comfort they could. A hand held, a prayer whispered, a morsel of bread placed gently on parched lips. Their compassion was undeniable, but it was not enough to overcome the darkness of ignorance. In my heart, I remember these places with sorrow. They stood as sanctuaries of intention, but not of cure, where bodies failed though spirits were lifted toward God. The fire of charity burned bright within their walls, yet it could not hold back the shadow of disease. To walk through a medieval hospital was to see both the beauty of selfless service and the tragedy of medicine bound more to death than to life. I remember the silence of towns where once there had been laughter, broken only by the toll of bells and the wheels of carts carrying away the dead. The Black Death swept through Europe like a storm, leaving few untouched. Families vanished in days, priests fell beside their flock, and whole villages stood abandoned. In such terror, people sought remedies wherever hope might flicker, however strange or cruel they seemed. Flagellants marched through the streets, lashing their own backs until blood ran, believing the scourge was God's punishment for sin. I watched them chant and cry, their bodies broken by their own hands, yet the pestilence did not falter. Others inhaled powders of crushed emeralds or carried gems against their skin, persuaded that precious stones held power to cleanse the air. Such desperate measures revealed the depth of fear and the blindness of the age. Herbs and flowers were stuffed into pouches, carried at the nose in hopes of warding off death. People clutched rosemary, lavender, and rue as if life itself were bound in their fragrance. Fires were lit in homes to burn foul-smelling substances, thought to drive away the poisoned air. And still, the plague crept in through cracks and alleys, claiming the careful and the careless alike. Physicians donned their now famed beaked masks, filled with aromatic herbs and vinegar-soaked cloth. Their robes were coated in wax to repel the corruption they believed hovered in the air. To see such a figure in the street was to face the embodiment of fear itself, half man, half omen. They treated the sick with rods to keep distance, yet they too perished, for the mask could not protect them from what they did not understand. Blame fell on the helpless. Foreigners, beggars, and Jews were accused of poisoning wells, and many were killed not by the plague, but by the wrath of their neighbours. I walked through towns where suspicion was sharper than any sword, where scapegoats bore the burden of ignorance. Hatred spread faster than understanding, adding cruelty to catastrophe. The sickness destroyed bodies, but fear destroyed souls. Some sought safety in isolation, fleeing cities for countryside manners. Yet even there, the plague followed, carried by fleas hidden on rats, though none knew it then. I heard of nobles who sealed themselves behind thick walls, only to fall ill weeks later as the unseen enemy slipped through. Wealth offered little protection. The pestilence respected neither crown nor peasant's hut. The remedies, whether whips or emeralds, prayers or perfumes, availed nothing. The dead lay in mass graves, hurriedly covered as earth could scarcely keep pace with mortality. I saw priests bless pits filled with hundreds, their voices hoarse with sorrow. It was a time when despair reigned supreme, and men believed the very end of the world was upon them. What lingers most in my heart is the memory of human eyes, wide with terror, hollow with grief, searching for an answer that never came. The plague taught us the frailty of both body and knowledge, stripping away illusions of mastery. Medicine proved powerless, faith faltered, and the remedies of the age stood revealed as empty gestures before an invisible foe. In that silence, Europe changed forever, scarred by a shadow it could not escape. In those years of sickness, many believed the very breath of the earth carried death. The theory of miasma, of poisoned air rising from swamps, refuse, and corpses, guided the actions of physicians and peasants alike. I recall walking through towns where fires burned in the streets, filling the air with smoke intended to purify what was thought corrupted. The stench of illness was met with stronger odours, as if foulness could be fought with fire and spice. Bundles of herbs were hung from windows and tucked into clothing. People carried posies of flowers to their noses, convinced that sweetness shielded them from pestilence. Lavender, roses, and marigolds became weapons as much as adornments, and I saw children clutching them as tightly as charms. The gesture brought comfort, though the unseen plague cared nothing for fragrance. Still, hope often blooms where knowledge falters. Even physicians placed faith in fumigation. Homes were filled with the smoke of juniper, pine, or frankincense, and sick rooms became choking chambers of incense. At times, these fires drove away vermin, and so the practice bore unintended merit. Yet it was chance, not understanding, that spared a few while countless others still perished. The belief in poisoned air remained because it offered an enemy one could at least see and smell. I remember wells covered with heavy stones for fear that vapors from their depths might rise and infect the village. Swamps and marshes were shunned, their mists regarded as emissaries of death. In truth, these waters harbored the insects that carried fever, but no one knew it. The fear of miasma shaped where men built their homes and how they walked the land, even if their reasoning was flawed. The wealthy filled their chambers with perfumes, musk, and vinegar, draping themselves in scented cloths. I once entered the room of a nobleman who believed a sponge soaked in rose water, held constantly at his lips, would shield him. He died nonetheless, his faith in fragrance no match for the reality of disease. Yet to his family, the act was not in vain, for it showed his determination to resist the invisible. City councils even passed laws demanding cleanliness, not out of knowledge of contagion, but in hope of dispelling bad air. Rubbish was removed, carcasses buried, and streets washed with lime. These measures, though rooted in error, sometimes slowed the spread of sickness. It was as if truth walked in disguise, offering protection even as men misunderstood its nature. I often marveled at how wisdom sometimes hides beneath false belief. Sailors, too, feared the breath of foreign ports. Quarantines arose from this dread, though they were framed in terms of miasma rather than contagion. Ships were held offshore, their cargo and crew kept waiting until the air was judged safe. The very word quarantine, 40 days, was born of this caution. Though mistaken in cause, the practice occasionally stemmed disaster. Thus error and wisdom walked side by side. I often reflect on how the senses ruled the mind in those days. What smelled foul was thought deadly, and what smelled sweet was thought safe. Men sought in fragrance a shield against despair, and in smoke a weapon against corruption. The truth of disease lay hidden, yet the struggle to name it gave shape to action. In the haze of incense and fire, I saw both ignorance and a yearning for control, fragile sparks in the endless night of suffering. Few practices chilled me more than seeing a man's skull opened by human hands. Trepanation, as it was called, was thought to release evil spirits trapped within the head. I watched as healers drilled or scraped a hole into bone, their tools crude, their knowledge little more than inherited whispers. The patient, awake and trembling, endured pain beyond words. Some survived, bearing scars as permanent marks of this grim ritual. It was an ancient custom, far older than Christendom, yet it persisted into the Middle Ages with stubborn resilience. Seizures, headaches, and madness were all believed to arise from forces imprisoned in the skull. By opening a passage, the affliction might be expelled, leaving the sufferer healed. Yet more often it brought fever, infection, or death. Still, desperation made men submit, hoping relief lay in the sharp edge of iron. The tools were frightening in their simplicity. A knife, an awl, or even a heated metal spike could be pressed against bone. Without understanding of sterility, these instruments carried unseen death into the very heart of the body. I can still recall the acrid smell of bone dust, the sound of scraping that pierced even the bravest spirit. It was a trial not only for the patient, but for all who stood witness. Some healers believed they could read success in the color of the marrow or the flow of blood. A pale discharge meant release, a dark one foretold doom. Such signs were interpreted as messages from God or nature, though they were only the body's cries of distress. The line between superstition and observation blurred, leaving patients to the mercy of interpretations as fragile as smoke. Occasionally, stories spread of those who lived and improved after such ordeals. Their pain lessened, their seizures diminished, and neighbors called it a miracle. These rare cases sustained the belief that the practice had value, Yet for every survivor, many more lay buried, their deaths explained as God's will rather than the failure of the knife. I saw how men preferred the comfort of faith to the cold truth of error. Trepanation was sometimes used in battlefields, when warriors suffered head injuries. Surgeons sought to relieve pressure from fractures, not knowing the true causes of swelling within. Some regained their senses, others fell quickly into death. In this setting, the act was closer to necessity than superstition, but the risk was as great. The line between surgery and ritual blurred again, both driven by the urgency of survival. The practice reveals much of how medicine in those days mingled fear with hope. Spirits, demons, or humors, whatever the cause imagined, were always greater mysteries than the body itself. Men trusted the knife to do what prayer could not, even when both paths ended in silence. To see a skull pierced was to witness the human hunger for healing wrestle with the limits of ignorance. When I recall trepanation, I think of the courage of those who endured it more than of the healers who performed it. Their submission to the blade was not born of trust alone, but of desperation. They sought life and risked death, bartering agony for a chance at relief. Their scars, whether born in flesh or in memory, tell of an age where medicine reached into the head itself, yet never into the truth. Among all the trials of medieval life, none was so perilous and constant as childbirth. Women faced the ordeal with courage, though death hovered always at their side. Midwives, often the only attendants, relied on knowledge passed from mother to daughter, mingled with charms, prayers, and herbs. I stood once outside a cottage, hearing the cries of labour within, knowing that for every birth, the graveyard claimed another mother or child. The tools of the midwife were simple: swaddling cloths, oils, and hands both firm and gentle. They brewed teas of pennyroyal or mugwort to ease pain, though such remedies could also bring harm. Superstition coloured their work. Amulets were tied around the wrist, or holy relics placed near the bed. Faith and custom walked hand in hand, for no science could shield women from the dangers hidden in the act of life-giving. Mortality was cruelly high. Hemorrhage, infection, and obstructed labour often meant slow suffering without escape. Physicians seldom attended, deeming childbirth beneath their station, leaving women to the care of midwives alone. Some mothers survived many births, while others perished at their first. I recall graves lined with crosses where both mother and infant lay side by side, silent testimony to the fragility of their struggle. Communities honoured skilled midwives, for their presence was a comfort even when fate was unkind. These women bore great responsibility, yet also suspicion. If a child was stillborn or a mother died, whispers of witchcraft sometimes followed. I met one such woman who carried both gratitude and fear in equal measure, trusted by some, shunned by others. Her skill was her shield, though it never freed her from doubt. The church sought to oversee childbirth, insisting on baptisms as quickly as possible, often within hours of birth. Priests instructed midwives to sprinkle water upon infants too weak to live, ensuring their souls would not be lost. I have seen these hasty rites performed over babes who barely drew breath, a sorrowful mingling of relief and despair. The midwife became not only a healer, but also a guardian of the soul. Certain customs sought to protect mother and child from unseen harm. Candles were lit, prayers to the Virgin recited, and charms placed in the room to ward off evil spirits. Such acts revealed both love and fear, for danger was always expected. Yet even with rituals and remedies, survival was never certain. Each birth was a crossing of a narrow bridge, with death waiting on either side. Those who endured repeated childbirth bore bodies worn by the strain. Many women died young, their lives measured by the number of children they delivered. The absence of proper sanitation and knowledge left them vulnerable, and midwives could do little more than offer comfort. Still, their presence gave strength, for the touch of familiar hands meant a woman was not alone in her hour of peril. When I think of medieval childbirth, I remember not the cries of pain, but the silence afterward, the stillness when a new voice did not join the world, or when the hearth grew colder for the absence of a mother's song. The midwives bore these sorrows with quiet dignity, their work marked by both triumph and grief. They were keepers of life in its most fragile passage, witnesses to the courage of women who faced death each time they gave the gift of birth. There was no illness that struck more fear in the hearts of men than leprosy. To see the pale, mottled skin, the numb hands, and the slow wasting of flesh was to glimpse both suffering and social death. I remember the ringing of small bells, carried by the afflicted to warn others of their approach. People turned away, not only out of fear of contagion, but because they believed these sufferers bore the mark of God's punishment. Leper houses, or lazar settlements, were established on the edges of towns, often near chapels, where priests ministered to souls already cast out of society. I passed such places, their gates heavy with sorrow, where the sick lived apart from their families, bound together only by their common affliction. The isolation was as cruel as the disease itself. They endured not just decay of the body, but exile from the embrace of community. The treatments offered were pitiful. Ointments of mercury or arsenic burned the skin rather than healed it. Prayers were recited, relics touched, pilgrimages undertaken, yet no cure came. Many believed that by enduring the disease patiently, one's sins were cleansed. Thus, leprosy became both a trial and a twisted form of penance, forcing sufferers to see their pain as a spiritual burden to bear. Some were declared dead to the world through solemn rituals. I have witnessed a ceremony where a man stricken with leprosy lay in a coffin while a priest read prayers as if for the departed. He then rose to live apart, shunned though still breathing. Such rites showed how society sought to draw a boundary between the living and those who carried what they could not understand. And yet, not all responded with cruelty. Certain orders of monks and nuns devoted themselves to caring for lepers, washing their wounds, feeding them, and offering dignity where the world offered none. Their devotion was seen as a holy act, a reflection of Christ's own mercy toward the outcast. I have seen such compassion, quiet and steadfast, shining even in the midst of despair. Despite the fear, true contagion was less than most believed. Still, the dread of visible disfigurement was stronger than reason. The sight of sores, twisted fingers, and hollow eyes stirred revulsion, and men built walls around their fear. The disease became not only a physical ailment, but a mirror of society's inability to bear the brokenness of its own members. For the lepers themselves, faith was both burden and comfort. Many prayed more fervently than the healthy, trusting that their suffering held meaning in God's design. Hymns rose from their chapels, trembling yet resolute, filling the night air with voices that refused to be silenced. Even cast out, they sought light in the shadow, their endurance a testament to the strength of the human spirit. When I recall these souls, it is their loneliness that cuts deepest. They lived as strangers in their own towns, known more by their bells than by their names. The memory of their quiet processions along dusty roads lingers in me still. In their exile, they bore not only the weight of disease, but the heavier burden of human rejection, a burden far more deadly than the illness itself. In times when sickness resisted every remedy, suspicion turned quickly toward the hidden hand of witches. I saw women, often poor or widowed, accused of bringing fevers or wasting illnesses upon neighbors. Their healing herbs and whispered charms, once trusted, became grounds for condemnation when fortune turned against them. Fear, not proof, was enough to set a soul apart, branded as servant of the devil. Trials unfolded in villages where desperation outweighed reason. The sick looked for someone to blame, and healers who failed were easy prey. I remember a gathering where a woman was forced to recite prayers without falter. Her trembling voice was judged as guilt. The community found solace in casting blame, believing their suffering explained by malice rather than ignorance. Yet in truth, they traded justice for fear. Superstition colored every corner of life. A sudden storm, a spoiled harvest, or a lingering cough might all be laid at the feet of witchcraft. Children wore charms to protect them, cattle were sprinkled with holy water, and fields were blessed with ritual to ward off imagined curses. It was easier to believe in spells than to admit the limits of human understanding. And so, suspicion fed upon itself, growing stronger with each calamity. The remedies against witchcraft were as harsh as the accusations. I recall tales of boiling herbs forced upon the sick to purge enchantments, or firebrands waved over the bed to drive out evil spirits. When these failed, the blame deepened. The accused were dragged before councils, their fates sealed not by truth, but by the clamour of fearful neighbours. In many cases, death came not from illness, but from the noose or flame. Even physicians were not free from such beliefs. Many spoke of illnesses caused by the evil eye or by maleficium, acts of hidden sorcery. Learned men copied texts filled with instructions on counterspells, prayers, and protective amulets. The line between medicine and magic was thin, blurred by centuries of uncertainty. I knew men of study who condemned witches with the same fervour as the ignorant. Knowledge bent easily to fear, and yet not all who practiced folk remedies were condemned. Many continued to serve their villages quietly, offering teas, poultices, and blessings, their work tolerated as long as outcomes were favourable. But the moment misfortune struck, gratitude turned to suspicion. I have seen trust transform into hatred overnight, as quickly as the flame catches straw. The healer's art was as dangerous to her as to her patient. This climate of fear revealed the deep fragility of medieval society. When plague or famine struck, reason faltered, and people sought answers in the invisible. Witchcraft became the vessel of their dread, a shadow upon which they cast their powerlessness. To accuse was to take control, however falsely, of what they could not explain. The accused bore the weight of ignorance made flesh. When I think back upon those days, it is not only the cruelty of punishment that haunts me, but the silence of those who watched. Fear bound their tongues, and suspicion blinded their eyes. Witchcraft was less a force of the devil than a mirror of human desperation, showing how frail our grasp of truth can be. The graves of the condemned remind me that ignorance, left unchecked, can wound as deeply as any plague. On battlefields strewn with broken bodies, the only hope for many lay in the severing of limbs. I watched soldiers carried to makeshift tents, their cries piercing the din of war as blades were prepared. There was no comfort but wine or a stick to bite upon, and the work was swift and brutal. Limbs were taken, not for healing, but for survival, to prevent the rot that would claim the whole body if left unchecked. The saw was the surgeon's most dreaded tool, its rasping sound echoing in memory long after the act was done. Assistants held the patient down as iron teeth bit into bone, each stroke tearing more than flesh. The air filled with the mingled odours of sweat, blood, and fear. When the final cut was made, the wound was pressed with heated iron to staunch the bleeding. The patient often slipped into silence before the smoke cleared. Shock was a killer greater than the sword itself. Strong men who had endured battle fell lifeless under the strain of the knife. Their hearts faltered, their breath ceased, their bodies too overwhelmed by agony to survive. Those who lived carried the burden of infection, for cloth and tools were seldom clean. I have seen wounds blacken in days, the fever burning fiercer than the original injury. Still, there were moments when amputation gave life. I met men who survived, limping on crutches or carried on carts, grateful for breath if not for limb. Their scars became marks of resilience, though their futures were bound to hardship. For them, survival was not triumph, but endurance, and each day was lived in the shadow of pain. Yet even they gave thanks, knowing that without the knife, they would have lain among the dead. The surgeons themselves were not without courage. They bore the cries of men as heavy as the weight of steel. Their hands shook at times, but necessity drove them forward. No one envied their work, for each cut was both mercy and torment. I remember one who confessed to me that he prayed with every stroke, asking forgiveness for the lives lost under his care. Some amputations were performed not in war, but in villages, when frostbite, gangrene, or accident made it the only course. The scene was the same: crude tools, no relief, the body trembling under restraint. Family members often turned away, unable to witness the violence done in the name of saving life. These acts were not the triumph of medicine, but desperate gambles taken against fate. Legends sometimes praised survivors as chosen by God, their suffering turned into symbols of divine endurance. I met a man who said his missing arm was proof that Christ had tested him and allowed him to remain. Such beliefs softened sorrow, but they could not undo the hardship. Life without a limb was life diminished, marked by dependence on others in a world already harsh. As I look back, amputations without anesthesia remind me of the edge upon which medieval medicine walked. Between life and death lay only pain, and the knife decided which way the scales would fall. Those who endured it showed a courage beyond measure, though they seldom chose their fate. Their silence lingers in my memory, louder than the cries, a testament to the endurance of flesh and the limits of knowledge. Toothache was among the cruelties most feared, for it tormented rich and poor alike without mercy. I remember men who had faced the sword in battle, yet wept like children, from the pain of a single rotting tooth. There was no relief save for extraction, and so the barber's chair became both saviour and tormentor. Few entered it willingly, but all came when the agony could no longer be borne. The tools were simple: iron pliers, forceps, or even hooks fashioned for other trades. No care was given to numb the pain, save perhaps strong ale to dull the senses. I saw barbers plant a knee upon a man's chest, wrenching with all their strength to tear the tooth free. Screams filled the room, followed by silence heavy with exhaustion. Yet many thanked the barber afterward, for the torment had ended at last. Decay was rampant, though not from sugar as in later centuries. Bread hardened by ovens, stones in ground flour, and neglect of hygiene all conspired to wear teeth down. Few brushed, and fewer still had means to prevent rot. Vinegar rinses, or even urine, were used as cleansers, thought to drive away corruption. Such practices often worsened the pain, eroding enamel until the mouth was a ruin of broken stumps. Infections from abscesses were deadly, spreading swiftly to the throat or blood. I recall men who swelled grotesquely, their breathing laboured, their faces unrecognizable. The barber's crude extraction sometimes saved them, but just as often hastened their death. What was meant to heal became another path to the grave, yet the gamble was taken again and again. The relief of silence in the mouth was worth the risk. Some remedies leaned upon herbs, cloves pressed to the gums, mint for fresh breath, sage to soothe swelling. These brought momentary comfort, but no cure. Poultices of crushed roots or ashes were bound to the jaw, their warmth easing pain briefly before it returned. I saw mothers press warm cloths to their children's faces, whispering prayers that God might dull the suffering. Often, mercy came only with sleep or with death itself. The wealthy sought physicians who prescribed more elaborate potions, powders of bone, charred animal parts, or ground gems. Yet their outcome was little different from the barber's chair. All knowledge seemed to circle back to the same brutal end: pull the tooth or endure. The poor, at least, avoided the folly of wasting coin on remedies no stronger than superstition. In this, poverty shielded them from false promises. The barber's shop became a place of both necessity and dread. I have seen men sit in line, pale with fear, listening to the cries of those before them. The pole outside bore its spiral of red and white, signalling not only grooming but also pain. Each who entered knew he might leave lighter of both beard and tooth, his body wounded yet relieved. It was a bargain accepted with resignation. What remains with me is the image of men clutching their jaws in relief after the deed, tears mixing with blood, gratitude mingled with exhaustion. Dentistry in those days was no art, only survival. The barber was executioner of pain, bringing both suffering and release. In the silence that followed extraction, I often thought how fragile the line is between cruelty and cure, and how much of life was endured through necessity alone. Not all suffering came from disease itself. Often it was worsened by the very hands that sought to heal. Physicians turned to substances they believed carried hidden power, mercury, arsenic, and lead among them. I recall seeing silver liquid poured into mixtures, its strange gleam praised as a purifier of humours. Yet the patients who swallowed it weakened, their bodies poisoned from within by the so-called cure. Hope, mixed with metal, became a bitter draught. Mercury was most often prescribed for skin diseases and later for the scourge of syphilis, which crept across Europe with silent cruelty. Patients were anointed with salves or made to swallow small doses, their mouths filling with ulcers, their bodies trembling. Physicians mistook these signs as proof the treatment was working, blind to the fact that the remedy was the true tormentor. I saw men waste away, praised by their healers for responding to the cure. Arsenic too found its way into the healer's chest. Ground into powders or dissolved in drink, it was thought to drive out fevers or cleanse sores. Instead, it blackened the skin and stole breath from the lungs. The poor, desperate for relief, accepted such offerings without question, for the authority of the physician was seldom challenged. Their trust was betrayed by ignorance, though none could see it at the time. Lead was present not only in remedies, but in daily life, lining pipes and flavouring wines with its sweet salts. The wealthy consumed it unaware, mistaking the gradual poisoning for natural decline. Physicians, seeing the symptoms, prescribed further doses of poisonous cures, deepening the misery. It was a cycle that revealed how easily error feeds upon itself, binding healer and patient alike in a tragic loop. Alchemists contributed much to this hazard, their search for transformation weaving into medicine. They spoke of purifying metals, as if the same could be done for flesh. Their mixtures were prepared with solemn ritual, as if mystery itself lent strength to the potion. I once watched a man swallow a draught of mercury prepared with prayer and incantation. Within days, he could no longer walk. The cure had become his executioner. Some herbs were combined with these poisons, offering brief comfort that masked the damage. Willow bark eased pain, but when laced with mercury, it turned deadly. Patients believed the bitterness meant power, that suffering itself was proof of healing. In truth, they drank decay with each dose, their faith binding them tighter to the very hand that harmed them. I often wondered how many graves were filled not by sickness, but by medicine. The wealthiest were most exposed, for they could afford such advanced remedies. Kings and nobles submitted to mercury treatments, their decline witnessed by courts that mistook it for the will of God. Physicians defended their practices with pride, unwilling to admit failure. The poor, with only herbs and folk remedies, sometimes fared better simply by avoiding these costly poisons. In this, poverty offered a strange kind of protection. When I reflect on these practices, sorrow fills me more deeply than in any battlefield. To die from an enemy's blade is fate, but to die from the hands of one trusted to heal is tragedy. The glitter of mercury, the weight of arsenic, the sweetness of lead, all promised relief, yet delivered ruin. They stand as grim reminders of an age when ignorance turned medicine into poison, and faith in science was often more dangerous than the sickness itself. When the pestilence returned again and again, towns began to learn that isolation could slow its march. I remember ships held in harbours, their sails furled, crews forbidden to step ashore until days had passed. The number was set at 40, quaranta, giving birth to the word quarantine. Though men did not understand contagion, they saw with their eyes, that distance saved lives. In this, wisdom was born of observation rather than learning. City gates were closed, and travelers from stricken lands were turned away. Markets fell silent, inns stood empty, and fear lingered in every doorway. Those who arrived from plague-ridden places were held in camps outside the walls, sometimes watched by guards who dared not approach too closely. It was a cruel mercy, for many died in isolation, but it preserved the breath of those within. I have seen both sorrow and relief in such measures. Houses, too, were sealed when sickness was found within. Families were locked behind their doors, marked with signs warning others away. Food was delivered at a distance, and the healthy suffered with the sick until all were claimed or spared by fate. Cries from within echoed in the streets at night, haunting those who listened. The city saved itself, but at the price of human compassion. Some towns lit great fires at their boundaries, believing the smoke would cleanse travelers before entry. Others required bathing in vinegar or the burning of clothes before passage was granted. Though the reasoning was flawed, the effect sometimes worked, cutting chains of transmission without knowledge of its cause. I recall one village that endured the plague with fewer deaths, not by miracle, but by stern discipline in keeping strangers away. Not all accepted such rules. Merchants complained that their trade withered under these restrictions, and some bribed their way past guards. I saw entire communities undone by the greed of a few who valued coin over caution. Disease spread swiftly, punishing the disobedience of men who thought themselves cleverer than danger. In such failures, quarantine revealed both its necessity and the weakness of human will. Religious leaders often bless these measures, framing them as both protection of life and obedience to divine will. To care for the many by isolating the few was justified as God's justice, though little comfort it gave to those condemned to solitude. I watched priests walk the edges of quarantined houses, offering blessings from afar, their words carried on the wind to ears that longed for touch. These practices marked a turning point, for they showed that communities could act together to resist the unseen. Though the theory of miasma clouded their reasoning, the results taught them that rules and order could shape survival. This was not knowledge born of books, but of bitter experience, written in graves and sealed doors. It was a step, however halting, toward a new way of guarding life. When I recall those quarantines, I see not only fear, but the first glimmers of understanding. Men learned that their choices shaped the spread of death, and that unity could mean survival. Though countless still perished, the seeds of public health were sown in those grim days. The sight of ships waiting offshore, of homes marked and sealed, lingers with me as a memory of sacrifice. Painful, imperfect, yet a sign that humanity was beginning, however slowly, to resist the darkness. In the villages, far from monasteries or universities, it was the folk healer who held the trust of the people. I have seen them gather in cottages filled with the smell of dried herbs, muttering prayers and charms over bowls of steaming mixtures. Their craft was born of tradition, handed down through generations, shaped by trial and error more than study. To the peasants, these healers were as necessary as the blacksmith or the miller. Animal parts were often used in their remedies, chosen as much for symbolism as for effect. A broth made from owls was believed to cure seizures, powdered dog bones for fevers, or dried toads for warts. These practices blended superstition with a desperate search for answers. The healer's faith in these mixtures was matched by the patient's hope, even when the results were uncertain or deadly. Charms and incantations were common companions to the potions. Knots were tied in cords to bind illness, or words whispered 3 times over a wound to drive away spirits. I recall seeing a woman bury a hare's foot under her doorstep, convinced it would protect her children from plague. Such acts revealed more about the fear in men's hearts than about the nature of disease itself. Yet not all remedies were folly. Plants such as willow, garlic, or mint did bring relief, their properties discovered through observation of nature. Some healers knew which herbs soothed the stomach, eased childbirth, or calmed coughs. Though their explanations leaned on spirits or signs, their hands sometimes carried wisdom hidden beneath layers of superstition. These glimpses of truth shone like sparks in the dark. The church looked upon these practices with suspicion, branding many as sorcery. I witnessed accusations that turned gratitude into fear when a failed cure was taken as proof of witchcraft. Yet for all the condemnations, people still returned to their healers. Desperation outweighed caution, and trust in the familiar triumphed over fear of the distant priest or costly physician. Folk healers often worked in secrecy, their craft hidden from the eyes of authority. They gathered herbs by moonlight, chanted in the fields, and whispered to the sick behind closed doors. Their power lay not only in what they gave, but in the comfort they inspired. The poor, who had little else, clung to these rituals as they would to a cross. It was hope, more than science, that sustained them. These figures also held roles beyond medicine. They were counselors in grief, guardians of tradition, and keepers of stories that gave meaning to hardship. I remember one who sang as she tended the sick, her voice weaving sorrow and solace together. Her remedies may not have cured, but her presence eased the burden of those who suffered. Healing was not always of the body. Sometimes it was of the spirit. When I look back on the folk healers, I see both the peril and the promise of their craft. Their mixtures of bone, herb, and prayer reveal the confusion of an age caught between faith and nature. Yet in their humble cottages, far from the halls of learning, they preserved fragments of knowledge that would later be recognized as truth. They stand as a reminder that even in ignorance, compassion, and curiosity burned like coals, keeping alive the fragile hope of healing. Pilgrims filled the roads of Europe, their staffs striking the earth as they sought shrines where relics promised healing. I saw men and women walk for weeks to touch a fragment of the true cross, or to glimpse the bones of saints encased in gold. The sick pressed themselves against reliquaries, believing divine power flowed through the sacred remains. Their faith was deep, even when their bodies remained unchanged. Relics were treasured not only for their holiness, but for their supposed ability to cure. Drops of oil from lamps burning near a saint's tomb were collected in vials, sold to the faithful as medicine. I recall a mother rubbing such oil upon her child's chest, whispering prayers with each stroke. The boy coughed still, but her eyes glistened with hope, as though the saint's hand had touched him. The church encouraged such devotion, for relics drew pilgrims and offerings that enriched cathedrals and monasteries. Grand processions carried bones through the streets, with the sick stretching out their hands to brush against them. Bells tolled as incense rose, mingling reverence with desperation. The boundary between faith and cure blurred, and many believed salvation of body and soul came together in that single touch. I remember visiting Compostela, where the shrine of St. James drew thousands. Pilgrims of all nations crowded the cathedral, kneeling on worn stone floors polished smooth by countless knees. Each bore a wound, a sickness, or a sorrow, hoping the saint's presence might bring relief. Some left cured in spirit, others in body, though many left no different than they had arrived. Yet all carried the memory of devotion. There were tales of miraculous recoveries, whispered from village to village. A blind man said he regained sight after touching a saint's cloak. A lame woman walked after years of crawling. These stories fed the tide of faith, though none could prove their truth. Still, belief itself was a kind of medicine, lifting the hearts of those who longed for deliverance. Relics were not always genuine. Traders sold splinters of wood, claiming them pieces of the cross, or bones of animals passed off as martyrs. I saw peasants spend their last coins on such treasures, their hopes bound to fraud. The church struggled to regulate these practices, yet greed, often walked hand in hand with devotion. For the desperate, even false hope was worth the price. The connection between relics and healing revealed how deeply the medieval soul intertwined faith and the body. Illness was not seen merely as physical, but as a burden of the spirit, and touching the sacred promised release from both. I once witnessed a dying man smile as a relic was placed upon his chest. His breath failed soon after, yet his face bore peace. In that, perhaps, healing of another kind was found. When I recall the devotion to relics, I do not think only of deception or misplaced faith. I think of the way suffering drove men to search for light in whatever form it appeared. The bones, the vials, the fragments of cloth. They were vessels of hope in a world where medicine faltered. Though their power could not halt death, they offered something no leech or potion could: the strength to endure with faith intact. By the 12th century, new centers of study began to rise, their halls echoing with the voices of eager students. I walked once through Salerno, where the oldest medical school in Europe flourished, attracting scholars from many lands. There, lessons were drawn from ancient texts, with Hippocrates and Galen revered as unquestioned authorities. To question them was to risk ridicule, for tradition weighed heavier than discovery. Still, these schools marked the first flicker of organized learning in centuries of darkness. In Bologna and Paris, universities took root, their charters sanctioned by popes and kings. Students sat in cold stone rooms, copying every word of their masters, committing to memory the teachings of antiquity. The curriculum blended medicine with astrology, philosophy, and theology, for all knowledge was thought bound together. I recall hearing that a physician's chart was judged incomplete without reference to the stars. Thus, the heavens were as present in their lessons as the human body itself. Dissection was rare and often frowned upon, but occasionally permitted. I once watched a scholar in Montpellier cut into the body of a condemned criminal, his students crowding around with awe and dread. The smell was overwhelming, the silence deep as he traced Galen's words upon human flesh. Even then, corrections to the ancient texts were dismissed, for no man dared challenge the authority of centuries. Truth was glimpsed, but quickly veiled again. These universities granted degrees that carried prestige, setting apart physicians from barbers and folk healers. To bear such a title was to step into a higher station of society, trusted by nobles and kings. Yet the gulf between knowledge and practice remained wide. Learned physicians often prescribed the same bleeding, purging, and humoral balancing as their untrained counterparts. Their robes and titles gave honor, but their remedies still faltered. Manuscripts filled their libraries, copied by diligent hands. Works from Arabic scholars such as Avicenna's Canon of Medicine were translated into Latin, blending with the words of Galen and Aristotle. I saw in these volumes a bridge between cultures, carrying wisdom across frontiers. Still, even these insights were constrained by the rigid framework of old belief. New thought crept slowly, weighed down by reverence for the past. The cost of such education meant that only the wealthy or those sponsored by patrons could attend. Meanwhile, the poor still relied on midwives, barbers, or folk healers. Thus, a divide grew between the lofty halls of learning and the humble cottages of peasants. Knowledge advanced in theory, but suffering continued unchanged in the streets. I often wondered of what use learning was, if it did not reach the hands of those who needed it most. Discipline was strict, with lectures delivered in Latin, a tongue foreign to many who heard it. Students repeated the words aloud, often without grasping their full meaning, for understanding was less prized than obedience. I saw bright minds dulled by rote memorization, their curiosity shackled by tradition. Yet within a few, the spark of questioning survived, hidden but not extinguished, waiting for the right moment to burn. Looking back, I see the universities as both promise and prison. They preserved the wisdom of ages, safeguarded texts, and offered structure to the art of medicine. Yet their devotion to authority blinded them to discovery, and their remedies remained shackled to error. Still, these halls laid the foundation upon which later generations would build. Though their cures often failed, their pursuit of learning kept alive the fragile ember of knowledge in a world still heavy with superstition. When Europe stumbled in darkness, it was the scholars of the Islamic world who carried the torch of medicine. I remember hearing travelers speak of Baghdad, where the House of Wisdom preserved and expanded the writings of Hippocrates, Galen, and Aristotle. In Cordoba, Cairo, and Damascus, physicians debated openly, unafraid to correct the ancients where experience proved them wrong. Their libraries overflowed with volumes, while ours lay in ruins or locked away in cloisters. Avicenna, whom the Latins called Ibn Sina, wrote his Canon of Medicine, a work so vast it shaped learning for centuries. It described fevers, contagion, and the use of simple and compound remedies with clarity far beyond our own. I recall holding a translated copy in Latin, marveling at its depth, though many of my countrymen dismissed it out of pride. To admit the superiority of Muslim learning was difficult for Christian scholars bound by tradition. Another figure, Al-Razi, known as Rhazes, distinguished smallpox from measles, a revelation unknown in Europe until his words crossed the sea. His insistence on observation, rather than blind adherence to authority, marked a step toward true science. Yet, even as his wisdom reached our shores, it was often reshaped to fit within the framework of humours and astrology. Truth arrived, but it was clothed in the garments of old error. The influence of Arabic medicine entered through Spain and Sicily, where translations into Latin opened new paths of study. I passed through Toledo, where scholars laboured night and day, rendering Arabic texts into words the universities could teach. Their work was a bridge across cultures, though many in Christendom crossed it reluctantly. Suspicion of the Muslim world often outweighed gratitude for its wisdom. Hospitals in the Islamic lands were marvels by comparison to our own. In Damascus and Cairo, wards were divided by illness, and patients received not only care, but education and comfort. Cleanliness was observed more carefully, and music was sometimes used to ease the spirit. I heard pilgrims speak of such places with wonder, though in Europe, hospitals remained more akin to hospices for the dying. The contrast was painful to accept. The remedies described by Arab physicians blended herbs, minerals, and diet in ways both practical and thoughtful. They wrote of sugar syrups to soothe throats, distilled alcohol for cleansing wounds, and even the use of cold compresses to reduce fever. These were practices grounded in careful observation, not merely in ritual. I saw some European healers adopt them quietly, unwilling to admit from where they came. Still, the Church often resisted. Many feared that adopting Muslim knowledge would corrupt Christian faith, and so advances were embraced slowly. I recall masters who quoted Avicenna only after wrapping his words in the authority of Galen, as though they must pass through ancient Greece before entering Europe. Pride delayed progress, and the sick continued to suffer while knowledge waited at the gates. When I think on this, I see how fragile wisdom can be, scattered by war yet preserved by strangers. What we had lost through fire and neglect was safeguarded by those we called enemies. In time, their books reshaped our universities, though we were slow to admit it. The Arab influence was a lifeline, cast across centuries of ignorance. Without it, I fear medicine in Europe would have remained chained to shadows far longer. On the fields of the Crusades, where banners clashed and blood stained the sand, surgery became a grim necessity. I saw wounded men carried from battle, their cries mingling with prayers as surgeons prepared their crude instruments. Arrows, swords, and lances left wounds that demanded swift action, and the methods were harsh. Boiling oil was poured into gashes to cleanse them. Cautery irons seared the flesh, and limbs were often taken when infection threatened to spread. The exchange between East and West was fierce in arms, yet quieter in medicine. Crusaders encountered Muslim physicians whose knowledge was broader, whose instruments were more refined. Some learned new techniques, stitching wounds rather than simply burning them, using sponges soaked in opiates to dull pain, applying bandages soaked in vinegar for cleansing. I heard men whisper admiration for these methods, though pride and faith often kept them unspoken. Despite these glimpses of progress, most surgeries remained crude. On the battlefield, speed mattered more than precision. Surgeons hacked away splintered bone, sawed through shattered limbs, and bound wounds with rough cloth. Without true understanding of infection, many men who survived the sword perished days later from the rot within. I remember the smell of tents filled with wounded, heavier even than the stench of death. Knights were not spared the same fate as common footmen. I watched lords, once proud on horseback, brought low by fever after wounds were treated with fire and oil. No wealth could buy safety from ignorance. Their armor had shielded them from arrows, but not from the hands that cut into their flesh in desperate attempts at healing. The equality of suffering was one of the few truths on those fields. Some accounts tell of European surgeons adopting techniques seen in the East, yet these practices spread slowly. I recall one man who stitched flesh with silk as he had witnessed in Muslim lands, and the wound healed more cleanly than most. But such stories were treated as curiosities, not as lessons to be embraced. Distrust of foreign ways kept Europe chained to its old methods, long after better paths had been glimpsed. Battle itself made surgery unavoidable. Unlike fevers or plagues, wounds of war could not be explained away as punishment or miasma. They required the knife. This forced surgeons to confront the body directly, to learn through necessity what books alone did not teach. Still, their tools were blacksmiths' saws, their knowledge shaped by superstition. What might have been the beginning of true surgical science was dulled by fear of straying from tradition. I met men who bore the scars of those surgeries, their bodies marked forever by the crude mercy of the blade. Some limped home as living reminders of both courage and the limits of medicine. They carried not only wounds but stories of agony endured without relief, of fire and iron as their companions in survival. Their suffering was as much a legacy of the Crusades as the battles themselves. In reflecting on those campaigns, I see more than the clash of faiths. I see how war, though cruel, became a bridge where knowledge might have crossed. The battlefield offered glimpses of better ways, yet Europe clung stubbornly to its own. Amid blood and fire, the chance for progress was present, but too often ignored. Thus the Crusades left not only graves, but lost opportunities, where healing might have learned as much as war had destroyed. In many towns, the line between craftsman and healer was thin, and I've seen blacksmiths' tools pressed into service upon human flesh. Where physicians were absent and surgeons ill-equipped, saws meant for timber and tongs meant for iron were turned to bones and limbs. I once watched a crude amputation performed with a smith's hammer at hand, its blows steady but merciless. The forge and the surgery shared the same harsh smell of smoke and blood. The scarcity of specialized instruments forced such improvisation. True surgical tools, finely made, were costly and often limited to wealthy cities or universities. In villages, necessity ruled, and men reached for what was available. The smith's workshop, with its sharp edges and strong grips, offered what was needed to cut, pry, or crush. I have seen jaws pried open with iron clamps, the same once used for horses' tack. The body was treated like metal, something to be reshaped by force. These practices spoke not of cruelty, but of desperation. A wounded soldier or injured laborer had no time to wait for learned surgeons. Better a rough cut than a lingering infection, or so they believed. Yet infection often followed regardless, carried by rust and grime from the forge. I remember one poor soul who survived the injury but perished from the cure, his body too weak to endure what ignorance had wrought. Even when crafted tools were available, They often resembled the implements of craftsmen. Knives, saws, and drills differed little from those found in workshops. The boundary between healer and artisan was blurred, for both relied on skill with the hand and steadiness with the blade. I sometimes wondered if men trusted the blacksmith more than the surgeon, for the smith at least knew his tools well, even if the task was grim. Blacksmiths themselves were sometimes called upon directly, their strength and knowledge of iron valued in dire moments. I have heard of smiths pulling teeth, setting bones, and even sealing wounds with heated tongs. Though untrained in medicine, they bore the trust of their neighbours, who saw in them a figure of practical courage. What they lacked in wisdom, they supplied in resolve, though often at the patient's expense. Accounts from war confirm this mingling of crafts. Battlefield surgeons carried little beyond knives and clamps, relying on smiths to lend them saws and hammers when need arose. The wounded were treated under the same sun that shone upon forges, their cries echoing against steel that knew no difference between shaping iron and shaping flesh. I have never forgotten the sight of blood dripping onto the same anvils where horseshoes were made. This blending of roles revealed how poorly prepared medicine was for the realities of human suffering. The lack of dedicated instruments was not mere poverty, but a reflection of how lowly surgery was regarded. Healing of the body was left to improvisation, while scholars debated humours and stars. I often thought that true progress would begin only when men forged tools not for beasts or timber, but for flesh itself. In memory, the image of Smith's tools turned to surgery remains vivid. It shows both the resilience and the tragedy of medieval life, where necessity drove men to acts both heroic and harmful. The forge and the infirmary shared the same tools, but their purposes were worlds apart. To the patient, it mattered little who held the saw, only that hope survived long enough to endure the pain. Those afflicted in mind were feared as much as the plague, for their suffering could not be seen in wounds or fevers. I remember walking through villages where the mad were chained in barns or cellars, their cries muffled by wooden doors. Families believed them possessed, their wild eyes and trembling voices mistaken for signs of the devil's grip. Instead of care, they received suspicion, isolation, and the weight of shame. Exorcism was the common response, for priests declared that evil spirits had taken root in their souls. I have seen holy water cast upon the frantic Latin prayers spoken over bodies writhing in torment. Sometimes the afflicted grew quiet, whether from exhaustion or faith, and this was taken as proof that the rite had succeeded. More often, their suffering remained, but the ritual was repeated until hope or patience faded. Others endured harsher treatments. Beatings were thought to drive out demons, blows meant to force spirits from the flesh. Chains and stocks restrained those who wandered or raved, their wrists rubbed raw by iron. I once saw a woman forced to wear a heavy cross about her neck, believed to weigh down the evil within her. Such cruelties were not born of malice, but of fear, for ignorance turned compassion into punishment. There were whispers of remedies drawn from herbs, such as valerian or poppy, meant to calm restlessness. Some healers brewed teas to quiet the troubled mind, though their work was often dismissed as superstition. I recall a monk who sang psalms softly to the disturbed, his voice a steady balm that eased their torment for a time. Such moments of kindness were rare, overshadowed by the harsher hand of discipline and exorcism. In towns, the insane were sometimes paraded through the streets, mocked and pitied in equal measure. They were reminders of frailty, of how swiftly the mind could betray even the strongest. People gave alms not to heal them, but to soothe their own fear of sharing the same fate. Madness was seen less as illness than as divine judgment, and so mercy was scarce. Certain monasteries took in the mentally ill, offering them food, shelter, and prayer. Yet these sanctuaries were exceptions, not the rule. Most sufferers remained hidden away, their lives shortened by neglect or abuse. The silence surrounding their fate was heavy, for families seldom spoke of them openly. Their presence was a wound upon the household, endured in secrecy. The learned tried to explain insanity through humours, claiming an excess of black bile caused melancholy or madness. Physicians prescribed bleeding or purging, weakening bodies already frail. The mind was forced into the same mould as the body, though its mysteries resisted such simple answers. I saw men drained until pale, their madness unchanged, their strength stolen in the name of cure. What remains with me is the haunting gaze of those left untreated, their eyes reflecting both torment and longing. They bore the burden of fear greater than their sickness, condemned by misunderstanding rather than healed. Insanity, in those times, was not a malady of the mind, but a battlefield of faith and superstition. Those who suffered were prisoners of ignorance, and their silence lingers in my memory like a wound that never heals. I recall the strange faith people placed in beasts, believing their parts held cures for human ills. In many villages, powders of crushed dog bones were given for fevers, and fox fat was rubbed upon the chest to ease coughs. The symbolism mattered more than reason: strength from the dog, cunning from the fox. To consume an animal was thought to borrow its essence, as though nature's powers could be swallowed into one's veins. Owl broth was boiled for those suffering seizures, its wings seen as guardians against restless spirits. I once watched a family prepare such a dish, their eyes filled with hope, though the child remained pale and trembling. The taste was bitter, the smell foul, yet they pressed it upon his lips. In truth, it brought no healing, but their faith in the bird's wisdom was unwavering. The use of snakes was also common, their skins dried and ground to powder, swallowed for strength or applied to wounds. Some believed venom itself, in small measure, could purify the blood. I saw men place faith in these concoctions, though more often they poisoned rather than cured. The serpent, symbol of both death and renewal, was both feared and sought in equal measure. Parts of larger beasts were also taken into the healer's chest. Bear fat was prized for joint pains, deer antlers ground for vitality, and the blood of roosters offered as a tonic for the weak. These remedies came as much from imagination as from any observation. People saw vigor in animals and believed it could be transferred, forgetting that the body is not a vessel for such transmutations. Not all of these practices were entirely without effect. Honey, taken from the labor of bees, was used to dress wounds, and it often prevented decay better than oil or cloth. Egg whites cooled burns, and their use was handed down as quiet wisdom. Yet such moments of truth were buried among endless recipes of dung, blood, and bone, where superstition reigned stronger than reason. Some remedies were grotesque. I recall hearing of urine mixed with ashes for toothache, or dung applied to swellings in hope of drawing out disease. These mixtures revealed not cruelty, but desperation, for when pain was unrelenting, any promise of relief seemed worth the trial. The sick became experiments, their bodies bearing the weight of every half-remembered cure. The belief in animals as vessels of healing also had roots in the doctrine of signatures. A hare, swift of foot, was thought to aid the lame. The heart of a lion, dried and powdered, promised courage to the timid. These connections were poetic, more than practical, but they carried meaning in a world where explanation was scarce. People looked to creation itself for patterns of healing, even if the patterns were illusions. When I reflect upon these practices, I see both the folly and the yearning of humanity. To turn to animals was to reach for the visible world when the invisible remained unknown. The sick clung to feathers, bones, and blood, as though they were keys to health, their faith as strong as their need. Though many remedies failed, they reveal how deeply men longed to wrest life from death with whatever tools creation placed in their hands. Among the most delicate of procedures attempted in those centuries was the treatment of blindness caused by cataracts. I remember sitting beside a man whose eyes were clouded like milk, his world reduced to shadows and voices. The healer prepared a thin needle of metal, placing it against the edge of the pupil. With a swift motion, he pressed the cataract down, clearing the man's sight for a fleeting moment. The people called this couching, though it was more gamble than cure. For some, the result was wondrous. They blinked in astonishment as light and color returned, even if dimly. Families wept with joy, praising God for what seemed a miracle. Yet more often, infection followed, the eyes swelling with pain until darkness closed in forever. I saw men blinded not only by their cataracts, but by the attempt to remove them, their hope extinguished by the very hand meant to save them. The tools were few and crude, fashioned from bronze, iron, or sharpened bone. They lacked the refinement for such delicate work, and the hand that wielded them could never be steady enough. Without knowledge of antisepsis, each puncture invited unseen death. I once heard of a patient who lost both eyes after couching, infection spreading from one to the other, leaving him not cured but destroyed. Still, the desperation for sight made men submit to the risk. A blind man was a burden to his family, unable to work, dependent on alms. Couching offered a chance, however slim, to regain independence. Even knowing the danger, many chose the needle over endless darkness. The decision was less about hope than about survival, for sight was life in a world where every hand was needed for labor. Physicians framed the practice within humoral theory, claiming cataracts were caused by phlegm congealed over the eye. To push it aside with a needle was thought to restore balance. Such explanations, though false, gave structure to the act, making it seem less like guesswork. In truth, it was trial and chance, cloaked in the language of ancient learning. The patient's fate rested on the steadiness of one hand. I recall hearing that in the East, more refined methods existed, and that some Arab physicians achieved greater success with couching. Their tools were sharper, their hands more practiced, and their writings more cautious about the dangers. Yet in much of Europe, those lessons spread slowly, and crude attempts prevailed. Pride once again barred the door to improvement, leaving suffering where mercy might have been. The procedure revealed the limits of medieval surgery most starkly. Unlike amputations or cautery, which dealt in brute force, couching required delicacy that the age could not yet provide. It demanded knowledge of anatomy, steadiness of hand, and cleanliness of tools, qualities rarely united in those days. The eye, so fragile, often paid the price for mankind's lack of readiness. When I remember those who endured couching, I see their faces filled first with wonder, then with agony, and too often with despair. The pursuit of sight revealed both courage and tragedy. Courage in those willing to risk it, tragedy in the countless who suffered worse for trying. The eye was a window to the soul, but in those days it was more often shattered by the attempt to open it than healed. When the Black Death loosened its grip at last, Europe stood transformed. I remember towns half empty, fields overgrown, and monasteries silent for lack of voices to sing. The pestilence had cut deep, not only into flesh, but into the very order of society. Yet from that devastation arose a grim clarity. Medicine, as it had been practiced, had failed utterly. Few could deny that change was needed, even if they did not yet know the path forward. The plague forced rulers and councils to think of health not only as a private burden, but as a public duty. Streets were cleared more often, wells protected, and cesspits regulated by law. I walked through cities where new ordinances demanded the removal of refuse, not merely for comfort, but to guard against future sickness. These measures, though born of error about miasma, were steps toward what we now call public health. Record-keeping also grew from necessity. Clerks began to note the number of dead, the spread of illness, and the measures taken by towns. Such chronicles, though grim, laid the groundwork for later study. I have read pages filled with sorrowful tallies, each line a family lost, but together they formed a kind of map of suffering. From those records, men began slowly to see patterns where before they saw only divine wrath. The authority of physicians suffered, for their remedies had failed in plain sight. Many people turned instead to folk healers, midwives, or apothecaries, hoping they might offer what learned men could not. Others grew cynical of all healers, believing survival rested more in fortune than in skill. I remember conversations in marketplaces where trust in doctors was spoken of with bitterness, their robes of learning seen as little more than costume. Yet not all was disillusionment. Contact with the Islamic world during those years brought renewed interest in their medical texts, which explained contagion more rationally. Avicenna's writings on quarantine and the spread of illness gained new weight. Slowly, European scholars began to translate and study these works, though they still mingled them with humours and astrology. The plague had cracked the door to wider knowledge, though the threshold was only barely crossed. The devastation also stirred questions of the soul. If sickness could strike the pious as swiftly as the wicked, perhaps not every illness was God's punishment. I heard priests struggle to explain why monasteries fell as swiftly as taverns, why prayers did not shield entire towns. These doubts did not break faith, but they shifted it, creating space for men to look beyond divine judgment for causes of disease. Villages that survived often did so through stricter rules of cleanliness or isolation, lessons remembered in later outbreaks. I recall one town that walled itself off, suffering hunger but sparing most of its people. Stories of such survival spread, planting seeds in the minds of future generations. In this way, the plague became a harsh teacher, showing by death what might preserve life. When I reflect upon its legacy, I see the Black Death as both curse and catalyst. It robbed Europe of millions, yet forced men to reckon with the weakness of their knowledge. Out of the silence of abandoned streets grew the first murmurs of reform, a slow turning from superstition toward observation. The plague's shadow lingered long, but within it lay the beginnings of change. A bitter gift, carved from despair. When Gutenberg's press spread across Europe in the 15th century, it was as if a dam had broken, releasing a flood of words that could no longer be confined to cloisters. I recall the first time I held a printed book, its letters sharp and uniform, unlike the uneven hand of monks. Knowledge that once trickled slowly through manuscripts now multiplied with speed and force. Medicine, too, was carried upon this tide, though what it bore was a mixture of truth and error. Old authorities such as Galen and Hippocrates appeared in countless editions, their words renewed as if fresh from the pen. Students in Paris or Padua could read the same passages without distortion of copying, yet the very certainty of print gave their teachings a weight they scarcely deserved, fixing errors into permanence. Bleeding, humours, and astrology spread as widely as the parchment that bore them. But alongside these relics of antiquity came newer voices. The writings of Avicenna, Al-Razi, and other Arab physicians were printed and carried into universities that once resisted them. Observations about contagion, hygiene, and rational remedies found broader ears. For the first time, competing visions of medicine could be compared side by side, not scattered in rare manuscripts, but bound in the same form. This clash of ideas stirred thought where silence had long prevailed. Illustrations brought another change. Herbals were printed with woodcut images, guiding apothecaries and folk healers alike. Plants once misidentified in text could now be matched with pictures, though crude at first, later more precise. I saw peasants with such books in hand, pointing to figures of sage or comfrey, no longer reliant solely on memory or hearsay. The press carried knowledge beyond scholars into the hands of the common people. The cost of books fell, though they were never cheap. Still, merchants, craftsmen, and even some farmers began to own volumes, passing them down as treasures. I remember entering a home where a single herbal, worn from use, was kept as carefully as Holy Scripture. It was read not in Latin but in the tongue of the people, a new power born of translation and print. Yet printing did not banish superstition. Alongside medical texts circulated pamphlets of charms, guides to astrology, and remedies steeped in magic. The same press that spread wisdom also spread folly, granting both equal reach. A man might read of sensible treatment on one page and of powdered unicorn horn on the next. Truth and error traveled together, indistinguishable to most eyes. In universities, the abundance of books shifted learning from memory to study. Students no longer relied solely on lectures, but could consult the texts themselves. Debate grew sharper, for contradictions could not be hidden. I saw young scholars daring to compare Galen's words with their own observations, a seed of doubt planted by the very permanence of print. The press, though impartial, nurtured the soil from which questioning would grow. Looking back, I see Gutenberg's invention as a turning of the age. It did not cure the sick or cleanse wounds, but it spread knowledge faster than ignorance could silence it. Though much of what it carried was flawed, the very act of multiplication forced men to confront ideas more openly. The press was not the healer, but it was the messenger, preparing the path for the Renaissance, where medicine would at last begin to awaken. As the 15th century drew to its close, I felt the weight of centuries of ignorance begin to lift. The world that had once clung to relics, humours, and superstition now stirred with a hunger for discovery. Ancient texts recovered, Arab wisdom translated, and new books printed, all combined to awaken a restless spirit. I remember hearing of scholars in Padua and Florence who dared to challenge Galen, their voices no longer whispers, but declarations. The darkness had not vanished, but cracks appeared where light poured through. Dissection, once forbidden, began to take root as a practice of study. I recall hearing of students gathered in cold amphitheatres, watching as human bodies were opened not as vessels of sin, but as sources of truth. The form of the heart, the structure of the bones, the pathways of veins, these were revealed by sight rather than by parchment. To see flesh for what it was broke chains that centuries of repetition had forged. Art itself became a companion to medicine. Men like Leonardo da Vinci sketched the human body with precision unmatched, blending beauty and knowledge into one. His drawings showed not spirits or humours, but muscles, sinews, and organs with startling clarity. It was as though the body, long misunderstood, was finally seen as a masterpiece of design, worthy of study rather than fear. The teachings of Avicenna and Al-Razi, once resisted, found firm footing in European thought. Alongside them, new voices rose, building upon what had been borrowed. Scholars no longer whispered of contagion. They spoke it aloud, noting patterns of disease that spread from person to person. The seeds sown by plague and loss now sprouted into inquiry, as men sought not only to preserve life, but to understand its hidden workings. Printing carried these revelations far beyond the halls of learning. Physicians in distant towns read the same words as scholars in great cities, their hands guided by shared knowledge. Errors still endured, but truth travelled faster now, no longer bound by the pace of a single scribe's quill. The very rhythm of learning quickened, as though Europe itself had been shaken awake. The church too began to bend. Though faith remained the heart of life, it no longer silenced every question. Priests still prayed over the sick, yet they allowed physicians more freedom to explore remedies that went beyond relics and ritual. The body and the soul, once bound too tightly together, were beginning to be seen as separate, each with its own path of care. This shift was not sudden, nor was it complete. Many still clung to charms, to bloodletting, to astrology. But the tide had turned, and knowledge at last found firmer ground. I saw in this change the resilience of mankind, that even after centuries of wandering in error, the spark of curiosity could not be extinguished. Pain and loss had been cruel teachers, yet they led us toward renewal. When I think upon that age, I see it as a crossing from shadow into dawn. Medicine remained imperfect, but it was no longer chained fully to superstition. The Renaissance opened doors long locked, inviting men to seek truth with eyes unclouded. From darkness, light had come, not by miracle, but by perseverance. And though the fires of ignorance still smouldered, They could not withstand the rising sun of knowledge.